Walking through the front door of our Riverside Cabin on December 20th, I expected to find Ryan wrapping presents by the fireplace, maybe with hot cocoa waiting and Christmas music playing softly in the background. Instead, I found silence, empty rooms, and a hastily written note on our kitchen counter that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my life. The note was brief, cold, and devastating. Emma, I can't do this anymore. The wedding is off. I've left town. Don't try to find me. Take care of yourself, Ryan. But what shocked me even more was finding his brother Jake still there, sitting at our dining table with his head in his hands, looking as confused and abandoned as I felt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive up to Millbrook from Boston had been magical. Snow dusted the Vermont mountains like powdered sugar, and every house along the winding roads sparkled with Christmas lights. I'd spent the entire 3-hour journey planning our Christmas week together, mentally organizing last-minute wedding details and daydreaming about our future. Ryan and I had been engaged for 8 months, and our spring wedding was just 4 months away. Everything seemed perfect in my world as I pulled into the gravel driveway of our cozy cabin by the Millbrook River. The first sign something was wrong hit me before I even reached the front door. Ryan's truck wasn't in its usual spot, and the Christmas lights we'd hung together just 2 weeks ago were dark. The wreath I'd carefully chosen at the Pine Ridge Christmas market hung crooked on the door, as if someone had brushed past it hurriedly. My heart started racing as I fumbled with my keys, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Inside, the cabin felt hollow. The Christmas tree we'd decorated together stood in the corner, but half the ornaments were missing. Our stockings hung by the fireplace, but Ryan's was noticeably lighter, as if someone had removed items from it. The presents I'd wrapped and hidden under the tree were still there, but the ones Ryan had been working on were gone. Everything looked like someone had left in a hurry, taking only what mattered most to them. That's when I spotted Jake sitting at our dining table, still wearing his work clothes from the Mountain View restaurant where he managed the kitchen. His usually cheerful demeanor was replaced by something I'd never seen before: genuine distress. Jake had always been the steady one, the brother who stayed close to home while Ryan chased dreams and adventures. Seeing him there, looking lost and confused, made my stomach drop even further. "Jake?" I called softly, setting down my overnight. Where's Ryan? Why are you here?" He looked up at me with eyes that held the same bewilderment I was feeling. "Emma, I'm so sorry. I don't understand what happened either. He asked me to come over this morning to help him with something, and when I got here, he was loading boxes into his car. He just handed me this note and said to give it to you when you arrived." I took the piece of paper with trembling hands, recognizing Ryan's handwriting immediately. As I read the words that ended our engagement and our life together, I felt like the floor was disappearing beneath my feet. "Emma, I can't do this anymore. The wedding is off. I've left town. Don't try to find me. Take care of yourself. Ryan." That was it. 2 years of dating, 8 months of engagement, a shared home, a business we'd built together, and a wedding planned for April, all dismissed in 3 sentences. "Did he say anything else?" I whispered, sinking into the chair across from Jake. "Any explanation? Any hint about where he was going?" Jake shook his head slowly. He seemed frantic, like he was running from something. I kept asking him what was wrong, but he just said he'd explain everything later. He told me to stay here until you arrived because he didn't want you to come home to an empty house. "Emma, I swear I had no idea this was coming. Yesterday, everything seemed normal." I stared at the note again, trying to find some hidden meaning, some clue that would make sense of this sudden abandonment. Ryan had never been the type to run from problems. He was impulsive sometimes, yes, but he'd always been committed to us, to our plans, to the life we were building together in Millbrook. Just last week, he'd been excitedly discussing honeymoon destinations and talking about expanding our event, planning business after the wedding. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Outside, snow had started falling again, and I could hear the river flowing past our back deck. This was supposed to be our magical Christmas week. We'd planned to attend the town's Christmas Eve service together, host Christmas dinner for our families, and spend quiet evenings by the fire planning our wedding details. Instead, I was sitting in our home with his brother, trying to process the reality that my fiancé had simply vanished. "Emma," Jake said gently. I called his phone about 20 times. It goes straight to voicemail. I even drove around town looking for his truck, but it's like he just disappeared. The weight of the situation began settling on my shoulders. Ryan wasn't just my fiancé. He was my business partner. We'd built heritage event planning together over the past year and a half, combining my organizational skills with his family's connections in the hospitality industry. The Mountain View restaurant, which his family had owned for 3 generations, was one of our primary venues. We had 12 weddings booked for the upcoming season, deposits collected, vendors contracted, and detailed plans in motion. How could he just walk away from all of that? I stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the river that had always brought me peace. The water looked dark and turbulent under the gray December sky, matching the storm that was building. Inside my chest, "Jake, what about the business? What about all our clients? We have the Morrison wedding next weekend, and 3 events scheduled between Christmas and New Year's." "I don't know," he admitted. "But Emma, you don't have to figure this out alone. Whatever's going on with Ryan, whatever made him leave like this, we'll handle it together. The restaurant is still here, my family is still here, and I'm not going anywhere." His words were meant to be comforting, but they only highlighted how thoroughly Ryan had abandoned not just me, but everything and everyone connected to our life together. I walked back to the dining table and sat down, really looking at Jake for the first time since I'd arrived. He was 3 years younger than Ryan, with the same dark hair but a gentler face, where Ryan was always moving, always planning the next adventure. Jake had a steady calmness that had always made him easy to be around. "I need to check our business accounts," I said suddenly, a new fear creeping into my mind. If he was planning this, if he's been thinking about leaving for a while. Jake watched as I pulled out my laptop and logged into our business banking. My hands were shaking as I navigated through the accounts we'd built together. Heritage event planning had been growing steadily, and we'd accumulated a decent reserve, fund for equipment purchases and expansion plans. My heart sank as I stared at the screen. The main business account showed a balance of $247. 3 days ago, it had contained over $15,000. "Oh my God," I whispered, feeling like I might be sick. Jake, he took everything. All the money from our business account, all the deposits our clients paid us. Everything. Jake moved to look over my shoulder at the screen. "That can't be legal. Those deposits, they're not his money to take. They belong to the clients, right?" I scrolled through the transaction history, seeing a pattern of transfers over the past 2 weeks that I'd been too busy with my own work to notice. Ryan had been systematically moving money out of our business accounts and into personal accounts that I apparently didn't have access to. Each transfer was just under the amount that would trigger automatic notifications to both of us, showing a level of planning that made his sudden departure seem much more calculated than spontaneous. "The Morrison wedding is in 6 days," I said, my voice barely audible. "They paid us $8,000 as a final payment last month. The vendor deposits for their flowers, catering, and music are due tomorrow. If I can't pay them, not only will I lose the business, but I'll be responsible for ruining their wedding." The full scope of my situation was becoming clear. Ryan hadn't just left me emotionally devastated. He'd systematically destroyed the business we'd built together and left me holding responsibility for commitments I couldn't fulfill. Every vendor we'd worked with, every client who'd trusted us with their special day, Every family member who'd supported our dreams, they would all see me as the one who failed them. Jake pulled out his phone. I'm calling Mom. She needs to know what's happening, and maybe she has some idea where Ryan might have gone or why he would do this. As he dialed, I continued exploring our business records, discovering more troubling patterns. Ryan had been the one who handled most of our vendor relationships and client communications, which now seemed like a deliberate strategy to maintain control. Most of our important business contacts were in his phone, saved under passwords I didn't know. Our social media accounts for the business were linked to his personal email addresses. Even our business insurance policies listed him as the primary contact. Carol Harrison answered Jake's call on the second ring. I could hear her cheerful voice through the phone, probably expecting to discuss Christmas dinner plans. Jake's explanation was gentle but direct, and I watched his face grow more serious as he listened to his mother's response. "What did she say?" I asked when he hung up. "She's as shocked as we are. She said Ryan seemed normal when she saw him yesterday at the restaurant. He was talking about Christmas plans and asking about scheduling for next week. But Emma, she mentioned something strange. Apparently, Ryan had been asking her a lot of questions lately about the restaurant's finances, about how much it was worth, about what would happen if they ever decided to sell it. A new fear crept into my mind. Jake, you don't think he would try to convince your parents to sell the restaurant, do you? Take that money and disappear completely? I don't know what to think anymore, he admitted. This isn't the brother I know. Ryan's always been impulsive, but he's never been dishonest. Something must have happened, something that made him panic. I closed my laptop and looked around our cabin one more time. Every corner held memories of the life we'd been building, together. The couch where we'd spent countless evenings planning our future, the kitchen where we'd tested recipes for our catering menus, the bedroom where we'd dreamed about our wedding night and our honeymoon. All of it felt tainted now, like those memories belonged to someone else. The Christmas tree in the corner caught my attention again. I walked over and noticed that Ryan hadn't just taken some ornaments. He'd specifically taken the ones that meant the most to us. The ornament from our first Christmas together was gone. The handmade decoration I'd given him last year with our engagement photo was missing. He'd left behind the generic store-bought ornaments, but taken everything with personal significance. He planned this, I said to Jake, who had followed me to the tree. This wasn't a sudden decision or a panic response to some crisis. He's been planning to leave for weeks, maybe months. Taking the meaningful ornaments, moving money gradually, asking about the restaurant's value. He's been preparing his exit strategy while I was planning our wedding. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The betrayal felt deeper than just being abandoned. It was the realization that while I'd been living in our shared reality, Ryan had been living in a completely different world, one where he was already gone. Every kiss, every "I love you," every discussion about our future had been a lie he was telling while simultaneously planning his escape. Jake sat down on our couch, the weight of his brother's actions clearly affecting him too. Emma, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that our family still considers you family. Whatever Ryan's done, whatever his reasons, it doesn't change how we feel about you. You've been part of our lives for 2 years, and that doesn't just disappear because he decided to run away. His kindness was almost harder to bear than Ryan's betrayal. It reminded me of everything I was losing, not just my fiancé, but his entire family, the life we'd built in this small town, the future I'd planned and worked toward. I was 28 years old, and I felt like I was starting over from nothing. As evening approached, the reality of my immediate situation set in. I had nowhere else to go. My apartment in Boston had been sublet when I moved to Millbrook permanently 6 months ago. My job at the marketing firm there had been left behind when I decided to focus full-time on building heritage event planning with Ryan. My savings account had been nearly depleted when we'd invested everything into our business equipment and marketing. "Jake," I said quietly, "I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't stay here in this cabin, but I don't have anywhere else to go. And I have to figure out how to handle our clients, how to either fulfill their contracts or return their money that's gone." "You can stay at the family house," he said immediately. "Mom and Dad have plenty of room and they'd want you there. As for the business, we'll figure it out. Maybe we can work with the vendors to modify payment schedules or find ways to fulfill the contracts even without Ryan." I appreciated his optimism, but the situation felt overwhelming. Heritage event planning wasn't just a business. It was my identity, my passion, my proof that I could build something meaningful. Losing. It felt like losing myself, and facing the families who'd trusted us with their most important celebrations, having to tell them that their event planner had stolen their money and disappeared, seemed impossible. The snow was falling heavier now, and the cabin was growing cold. Ryan must have turned down the heat before he left, another small detail that showed how thoroughly he'd planned his departure. I gathered a few essential items into my overnight bag, leaving most of my belongings behind. Somehow, taking everything felt like admitting this was permanent, and I wasn't ready for that level of acceptance. As Jake and I prepared to leave for his family's house, I took one last look around the cabin that had been my home, my sanctuary, my future. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of the river outside and the soft whisper of snow against the windows. This morning, I'd been Emma Rodriguez, successful event planner, beloved fiancé, and confident woman building the life of her dreams. Tonight, I was someone I didn't recognize, abandoned, betrayed, and completely alone in figuring out how to survive the wreckage of what my life had become. The drive to the Harrison family house was quiet, both Jake and I lost in our own thoughts. The Christmas lights throughout Millbrook looked different now, their cheerful glow mocking the darkness that had settled over my world. As we pulled into the driveway of the large farmhouse where Ryan had grown up, I realized that tomorrow would bring a whole new set of challenges. I would have to face Carol and David Harrison, explain what their eldest son had done, and somehow find the strength to figure out my next steps. But tonight, as Jake helped me carry my bag to the guest room that had once been my future brother-in-law's childhood bedroom, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd lost. My fiancé, my business, my home, my financial security, and my faith in my own judgment, all gone in the space of a few hours on what was supposed to be the most magical night of the year. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with fresh snow covering the Harrison family farmhouse like a heavy blanket. I woke up in Jake's childhood bedroom, surrounded by faded baseball posters and shelves of dusty trophies, feeling disoriented and hollow. For a moment, I forgot where I was and why I was there. But reality crashed back as soon as I saw my hastily packed overnight bag sitting on the dresser. Downstairs, I could hear Carol Harrison moving around the kitchen, the familiar sounds of coffee brewing and breakfast preparation that had always made this house feel warm and welcoming. Now those same sounds felt different, tinged with the awkwardness of my new status as the abandoned fiancé who had nowhere else to go. I dressed quickly and made my way downstairs, dreading the conversations that awaited me. Carol was standing at the stove making pancakes, her graying hair pulled back in the same messy bun she'd worn every morning for as long as I'd known her. When she saw me, her face crumpled with sympathy and anger in equal measure. "Emma, honey, I am so sorry. I spent half the night trying to understand how my son could do something like this. David and I were just devastated." She enveloped me in a hug that smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, the same comforting embrace she'd given me countless times over the past 2 years. But this time, instead of feeling welcomed into the family, I felt like an outsider being consoled for my loss of that very belonging. I keep thinking there must be some explanation, I said, accepting the cup of coffee she pressed into my hands. People don't just disappear from their entire life without a reason. Jake appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work at the restaurant. His face showed the strain of a sleepless night, and I realized that Ryan's abandonment had devastated his family almost as much as it had me. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about this being planned, he said, pouring himself coffee. I remembered something. About 3 weeks ago, Ryan asked me a bunch of strange questions about the restaurant's books, about how our vendor contracts work, about what would happen if we ever had to close temporarily. Carol set down her spatula and turned to face us. He asked me similar things. I thought he was just trying to understand the business better since you two were planning to expand your event planning into catering. But now I'm wondering if he was looking for something specific. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Vermont winter. What kind of something? Well, Carol said slowly, he was particularly interested in our cash flow patterns, asking when we receive payments from clients and how long money sits in our accounts before we pay vendors. At the time, I thought he was learning about restaurant management, but looking back, the implication hung heavy in the air. If Ryan had been studying his family's business finances with the same methodical approach he'd used to drain our event planning accounts, then his disappearance might be part of a much larger scheme. I thought about the $15,000 he'd taken from Heritage Event Planning and wondered if that was just the beginning. I need to understand exactly what he had access to, I said, pulling out my phone. Not just our business, but anything he might have been involved with. Jake, do you have records of when Ryan last worked at the restaurant? What he might have had access to there? Over the next hour, we pieced together a troubling picture. Ryan had been helping with the restaurant's books for the past month, claiming he wanted to modernize their accounting system as a Christmas gift to his parents. He'd convinced them to give him access to their business banking to set up new software and streamline their vendor payments. Carol showed me the login credentials he'd asked for, written in his handwriting on a piece of paper tucked into their kitchen drawer. When was the last time you actually checked your account balances? I asked gently, not wanting to alarm them but needing to know the scope of what we were dealing with. David Harrison, who had been quietly listening from his chair by the window, spoke up for the first time. Ryan said he'd handle our year-end banking so we could focus on the holiday rush. Said he'd have everything organized for our accountant by New Year's. We trusted him completely. The weight of that trust settled heavily on my shoulders. I realized that my own betrayal was just one piece of a larger puzzle, and that Ryan's family might be facing the same devastating financial loss that I was. Mr. Harrison, I think we need to check those accounts right now. The next 20 minutes were among the most difficult I'd ever experienced. Using David's laptop, we logged into the Mountain View restaurant's business accounts and discovered that Ryan's systematic theft had extended far beyond Heritage Event Planning. Over the course of the past 3 weeks, he'd transferred nearly $40,000 from the restaurant's accounts, leaving them with barely enough to cover their immediate payroll and vendor obligations. Carol sat down heavily at the kitchen table, her face pale with shock. $40,000. That's almost everything we had saved for the roof repairs and the new kitchen equipment. That's money we've been setting aside for years. I felt sick, realizing that my personal devastation was nothing compared to what Ryan had done to his own family. The Harrisons had built their restaurant over 3 decades, creating a beloved gathering place for the Millbrook community and a solid foundation for their retirement. Ryan had stolen not just money, but their security and their trust in their own son. There's more, Jake said quietly, continuing to scroll through the transaction history. He didn't just take money from the main accounts. He somehow accessed the account where Mom and Dad keep their personal savings, the one they thought was separate from the business. The number on the screen made my stomach turn. Another $25,000 gone from their personal retirement fund, transferred out in smaller amounts over the past 2 weeks while his parents had been busy preparing for the Christmas season. Ryan hadn't just betrayed me. He'd systematically robbed his own family while they welcomed him into their most private financial affairs. "I need to call the police," David said, reaching for his phone with trembling hands. "This isn't just personal betrayal anymore. This is theft, fraud, criminal behavior." But as we discussed involving law enforcement, the complications became clear. Ryan was an authorized user on all the accounts he'd accessed. He'd been given permission to handle the restaurant's finances and had convinced his parents to add him to their personal accounts as well. Legally, his actions might be difficult to prosecute, especially since he was family and had been explicitly given access. "Even if the police can help," Carol said, "how do we get the money back? If Ryan's really gone, if he's taken everything and disappeared, we might never see any of it again." I spent the rest of the morning making phone calls, trying to understand our options and the full scope of the damage. Speaking with our bank representatives, I learned that Ryan had been incredibly methodical in his theft. He'd used legitimate banking procedures, transferring money between accounts he was authorized to access, and had even maintained proper documentation that made his actions appear like normal business operations. The heritage event planning situation was even more complicated. As Ryan's business partner and co-owner, I was legally responsible for fulfilling our contracted obligations to clients, even though I no longer had access to the money they'd paid us. The Morrison wedding was in 5 days, and their $8,000 final payment was gone, along with all the funds I needed to pay vendors for their flowers, catering, and entertainment. Madison Torres, my best friend from college who worked as a paralegal in Burlington, drove down that afternoon to help me understand my legal options. We sat in the Harrisons' living room, surrounded by legal documents and bank statements, trying to make sense of a situation that seemed designed to leave me powerless. "The problem is that Ryan was smart about this," Madison explained, reviewing the papers I'd gathered. "He didn't technically steal from clients. He stole from your business account, which he legally had access to as your partner. From a legal standpoint, you're both equally responsible for the business debts and obligations. So even though he took the money and disappeared, I'm the one who has to find a way to fulfill our contracts or face lawsuits from our clients?" Exactly. And Emma, it gets worse. If you can't fulfill these contracts, if clients lose money, because of your business failure, they can come after your personal assets too. Your car, any savings you have, anything of value. I thought about my limited personal assets. A 5-year-old Honda Civic with payments still remaining. A small savings account that had been nearly emptied when we invested in business equipment. And my grandmother's engagement ring that I'd planned to pass down to my own daughter someday. It wasn't much, but it was all I had left in the world. Jake had been listening quietly from the kitchen doorway. What if we found a way to fulfill the contracts ourselves? The restaurant has relationships with most of the vendors' heritage event. Planning uses. Maybe we could work something out, cover the immediate obligations until we figure out a longer-term solution. Madison looked skeptical. "That's very generous, Jake, but we're talking about significant money. Just the Morrison wedding alone requires about $12,000 in vendor payments, and Emma has 11 more events scheduled over the next 6 months. You'd be taking on huge financial risk with no guarantee of recovery." The conversation continued for hours, exploring every possible option and finding complications with each one. Bankruptcy would destroy any chance I had of rebuilding my career in event planning. Trying to fulfill the contracts myself would require resources I didn't have and skills I hadn't developed independently. Canceling everything and returning. Deposits would require money that no longer existed. As evening approached, I found myself walking alone through the snowy streets of Millbrook, past the familiar shops and restaurants that had become my community over the past 2 years. The Christmas decorations that had looked so magical just days ago now seemed to mock my situation. Every twinkling light and festive display reminded me of the Christmas I'd been planning to spend with Ryan, the future I'd been building that had turned out to be an illusion. I stopped at the old mill bridge, the scenic spot where Ryan had proposed to me 8 months earlier. Standing in the same place where he'd promised to love me forever, I tried to understand how someone could plan such a thorough betrayal while looking into the eyes of the person they claimed to love. Had any of it been real? Had he ever actually intended to marry me? Or had our entire relationship been part of some long-term manipulation? My phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. My heart leaped, thinking it might be Ryan with some explanation or apology. Instead, the message was from Lisa Morrison, the bride whose wedding was scheduled for December 26th. Emma, I've been trying to reach you about the final details for tomorrow's rehearsal. Can you call me when you get this? Getting nervous about the timeline. The reminder of my immediate responsibilities hit me like a physical blow. Lisa Morrison was 23 years old, marrying her college sweetheart in a celebration they'd been planning for over a year. Her parents had saved for months to afford the wedding package we'd designed, and dozens of family members were traveling to Millbrook for the ceremony. In less than 24 hours, I would have to tell them that their wedding planner had stolen their money and disappeared, leaving their celebration in ruins. I called Madison, who was still at the Harrison house. "I can't do this," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't face these families and tell them that I've failed them. The Morrisons, they're so young and excited, and their families have invested so much in this celebration. How do I tell them that their wedding is destroyed? Because I was stupid enough to trust the wrong person?" "Emma, listen to me," Madison said firmly. "What happened to you is not your fault. You were systematically deceived by someone you loved and trusted. You're not responsible for Ryan's actions, and you're not stupid for believing in someone you were planning to marry." But her words, meant to be comforting, only highlighted how helpless I felt. Whether or not Ryan's betrayal was my fault, the consequences were entirely mine to bear. The clients who would lose their money, the vendors who wouldn't be paid, the reputation that would be destroyed, all of it would fall on me while Ryan remained safely hidden wherever he'd run. That night, back in Jake's childhood bedroom, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to process the magnitude of what I was facing. In 3 days, I'd gone from being a successful businesswoman planning her Christmas wedding to being a financially ruined single woman with no home, no income, and legal obligations I couldn't fulfill. The transformation felt so complete and so devastating that I wondered if I would ever recover from it. But as the hours passed and dawn began to lighten the sky outside, something inside me began to shift. The helplessness I'd been feeling started to give way to something else. Anger. Not just at Ryan for what he'd done, but at myself for accepting the victim role so completely. I'd spent 3 days mourning what I'd lost, but I hadn't spent any time thinking about what I might be able to build from what remained. I got up and opened my laptop, beginning to research everything I could find about Ryan's recent activities. If he'd been planning this betrayal for weeks or months, there had to be traces of his preparation that I could uncover. Social media posts, credit card records, communications with people outside of Millbrook, something that would help me understand not just what he'd done, but where he might have gone and whether there was any way to recover what he'd stolen. The sun was fully up by the time Jake knocked on my door, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing his work clothes for another day at the restaurant. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling into the chair by the window. "I'm done being a victim," I said, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. Ryan planned this betrayal carefully, and he made mistakes. He left trails, and he underestimated how determined I could be when everything I care about is at stake. Jake studied my face and nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "I need to understand everything Ryan had access to, everyone he spoke with, everywhere he went in the weeks before he left. And Jake, I need to know if you're willing to help me fight back, even if it means going up against your own brother." His answer came without hesitation. "Ryan stopped being my brother the moment he stole from our parents and destroyed your life. Whatever you need, Emma, I'm with you." As I began making lists of information to gather and people to contact, I felt something I hadn't experienced since finding that devastating note. Hope. Not hope that Ryan would come back, or that everything would return to the way it was, but hope that I might be able to build something better from the ruins he'd left behind. The woman who had trusted blindly was gone, but in her place was someone who understood betrayal intimately and was determined to transform that knowledge into strength. The investigation was about to begin, and I had every intention of uncovering not just what Ryan had done, but why he'd done it, and how I could use that information to rebuild everything he'd tried to destroy. Over the next 6 weeks, I threw myself into investigation and preparation with an intensity that surprised everyone around me, including myself. What had started as a desperate attempt to understand Ryan's betrayal evolved into something much more strategic and purposeful. I wasn't just trying to find answers anymore. I was building a case, developing skills, and positioning myself for a confrontation that I knew was inevitable. Madison had connected me with Sophia Chen, a forensic accountant who specialized in financial fraud cases. Sophia worked out of a small office in Burlington, but her reputation for uncovering hidden assets and tracing complex financial schemes had made her one of the most sought-after investigators in Vermont. When I first met her, carrying boxes of bank statements and business records, I felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what Ryan had done. But Sophia's methodical approach and sharp analytical mind gave me hope that his carefully planned deception might contain the seeds of his downfall. "Financial criminals almost always make the same mistake," Sophia explained during our first meeting, spreading my documents across her conference table like pieces of a puzzle. "They think they're smarter than the systems they're manipulating, but every transaction leaves a digital footprint. Every transfer creates a record, and every lie requires additional lies to support it." Working with Sophia, I discovered that Ryan's theft had been even more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. He'd been moving money through a network of accounts, using legitimate business transfers to mask what was essentially a systematic looting operation. But more importantly, Sophia identified patterns in his transactions that suggested he hadn't acted alone and hadn't simply disappeared into thin air. "Look at these transfer dates," Sophia said, pointing to a timeline she'd created on her whiteboard. "The money doesn't just leave your accounts and vanish. It moves through a series of intermediate accounts before ending up in places that suggest a specific destination. These aren't random transfers. They're strategic movements designed to establish financial resources in a particular location." The location turned out to be Colorado, specifically the mountain resort town of Aspen. Through careful analysis of the financial trails, Sophia uncovered evidence that Ryan had been establishing a new identity and business presence there for months. Property records showed a rental agreement signed in November for a luxury condo in Aspen. Business registration documents revealed that he'd incorporated a new event planning company called Alpine Celebrations just 3 weeks before his disappearance from Millbrook. "He's not hiding," Sophia concluded. "He's relocated, and he's used the money he stole from you and his family to establish what looks like a legitimate business in a completely different market." The revelation was simultaneously devastating and empowering. Devastating because it confirmed that Ryan's betrayal had been calculated and premeditated to a degree I'd never imagined. Empowering because it meant he was findable, and more importantly, it meant the money he'd stolen was still in play. Not simply lost forever, but understanding where Ryan had gone was only part of what I needed to rebuild my life and business. The immediate crisis with heritage event planning clients still required urgent attention, and Jake had emerged as an unexpected ally in developing solutions that none of us had initially considered possible. What if we don't just try to fulfill the existing contracts, Jake proposed during one of our evening strategy sessions at the Harrison farmhouse. What if we use this crisis as an opportunity to build something better than what you had before? The idea seemed impossible at first. I had no money, no business credit, no office space, and a reputation that would be destroyed as soon as word spread about Heritage Event Planning's collapse. But Jake's perspective was different. As someone who'd grown up in the restaurant business and understood the intricate relationships between vendors, venues, and service providers in small-town Vermont, he saw opportunities that I'd been too devastated to recognize. The vendors know you, Emma. They know your work, your integrity, your attention to detail. They also know that Ryan was always the weak link in Heritage Event Planning, the one who promised things he couldn't deliver and cut corners when he thought no one was looking. What if we approached them not as a failing business trying to fulfill old contracts, but as a new partnership offering better terms and more reliable service? Over the following weeks, Jake and I developed a proposal that was audacious in its scope and ambition. Instead of simply trying to salvage Heritage Event Planning, we would create something entirely new: a collaborative event planning service that combined the Mountain View restaurant's established reputation and vendor relationships with my organizational skills and creative vision. The Harrison family would provide the initial financial backing and business infrastructure, while I would contribute my expertise and take responsibility for growing the new venture into profitability. The plan required me to be completely honest with our existing clients about what Ryan had done, but to present that honesty within the context of a stronger, more reliable service offering. Instead of telling the Morrisons that their wedding planner had stolen their money and disappeared, I would tell them that Heritage Event Planning was being restructured under new management with enhanced financial backing and vendor relationships. "It's risky," Madison warned when I outlined the strategy. "You're betting everything on the assumption that clients will trust you personally more than they distrust the business circumstances. And you're asking the Harrison family to invest significant money in a venture that could fail if your reputation doesn't survive this crisis." But David and Carol Harrison surprised everyone by embracing the plan with an enthusiasm that spoke to their anger at Ryan's betrayal and their genuine affection for me. "Ryan stole from us financially," Carol said during a family meeting where we formalized our partnership agreement. "But more than that, he stole our trust and our sense of family. Emma, you've been part of this family for 2 years, and his actions don't change that. We want to support you, and we believe in what you can build." The first test of our new approach came with the Morrison wedding, which we had to reorganize completely with just 48 hours' notice. Instead of the outdoor ceremony Lisa had originally planned, we created an intimate celebration in the Mountain View restaurant's private dining room, with Jake's kitchen team providing a customized menu that exceeded anything Heritage Event Planning had previously offered. The result was a wedding that was smaller than originally planned, but more personal and memorable than the couple had dared to hope. "Emma," Lisa Morrison said at the end of her reception, "I know something went wrong with your original plans, but honestly, this was so much better than what we talked about before. It felt like we were celebrating with family instead of just hiring vendors." That success gave me confidence to approach our other clients with the same combination of honesty and enhanced service offerings. In each case, I explained that Heritage Event Planning was being restructured due to partnership changes, that all financial obligations would be honored under new management, and that clients would receive upgraded services as part of the transition. The response was overwhelmingly positive, partly because my personal relationships with clients had always been strong, and partly because the new partnership with Mountain View Restaurant offered tangible benefits that Heritage Event Planning had never been able to provide. Instead of renting generic venue spaces, we could offer the charm and established reputation of a beloved local restaurant. Instead of coordinating with multiple vendors, we could provide integrated catering, event planning, and venue services under one roof. But even as I was rebuilding my professional life, I continued working with Sophia to trace Ryan's activities and understand the full scope of his deception. What we discovered was a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond his theft from me and his family. Through social media analysis and public record searches, Sophia uncovered evidence that Ryan had been involved in similar schemes in other locations before moving to Millbrook. "He's done this before," Sophia explained, showing me documentation of a failed event planning business in New Hampshire that Ryan had been involved with 3 years earlier. Similar pattern: establish credibility through a romantic relationship, gain access to family and business finances, then disappear when the scheme becomes unsustainable. The revelation changed everything I thought I knew about my relationship with Ryan. What I'd believed was a love story that had turned tragic was actually a carefully orchestrated manipulation that had been planned from the beginning. Every milestone in our relationship, every major decision we'd made together, every moment I'd treasured as evidence of our deepening commitment had been part of a systematic deception designed to position him for theft. "Emma," Sophia said gently, "I need you to understand that you weren't chosen randomly. Ryan researched you before he ever asked you out. Your background in marketing, your family's modest financial success, your trusting personality, even your desire to start your own business. All of these factors made you an ideal target for the kind of long-term manipulation he specializes." And the knowledge was devastating, but it was also liberating. For weeks, I'd been torturing myself with questions about what I'd done wrong, what I'd missed, how I could have been so blind to someone's true nature. Learning that Ryan was essentially a professional manipulator who had studied and targeted me specifically removed the burden of self-blame and replaced it with a clear understanding of what I was dealing with. More importantly, Sophia's investigation revealed that Ryan's current situation in Aspen was more vulnerable than he probably realized. His new business, Alpine Celebrations, was operating under financial structures that could be challenged legally, if we could prove that its startup capital came from fraudulent sources. The luxury condo he was renting was secured by deposits that could be traced directly to the money he'd stolen from Mountain View Restaurant. His entire new life was built on foundations that could be undermined if we approached the situation strategically. "We have options," Sophia explained during a meeting in early February. "We can pursue criminal charges, though that would be a long process with uncertain outcomes. We can file civil suits to recover the stolen funds, but again, that could take years. Or we can approach this more directly." The third option involved traveling to Aspen and confronting Ryan directly, armed with comprehensive evidence of his fraudulent activities and a clear understanding of his vulnerability. The goal wouldn't be revenge, but rather a strategic negotiation that would result in full restitution and a permanent end to his ability to victimize others. "It's risky," Madison warned when I outlined Sophia's suggestion. "If you confront him directly, you lose the element of surprise for any legal proceedings. And if he's as manipulative as you now know he is, he might find ways to turn the situation to his advantage." But Jake, who had become my closest advisor and strongest supporter throughout this process, saw the direct approach differently. "Emma's not the same person Ryan manipulated and abandoned," he pointed out. "She's not approaching this from weakness or naivety anymore. She's approaching it from strength, with evidence, with backup, and with a clear understanding of exactly who she's dealing with." The conversation continued over several days, weighing the risks and benefits of different approaches. But ultimately, the decision came down to what would best serve my long-term goals. I wasn't just trying to recover stolen money or get revenge on someone who had betrayed me. I was trying to build a new life and business that would be stronger and more secure than what I'd had before. "I want to confront him," I finally decided. "Not because I need closure or want to make him suffer, but because I want him to see who he's dealing with now. The woman he manipulated and abandoned doesn't exist anymore. I want him to understand that his actions didn't break me. They transformed me into someone who won't be victimized again." Sophia nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right mindset for this kind of confrontation. You're not going as someone seeking justice from a position of weakness. You're going as someone offering a resolution from a position of strength. The planning for the Aspen confrontation took 3 weeks. Sophia and I developed a comprehensive dossier of evidence documenting not just Ryan's theft from me and his family, but his broader pattern of fraudulent behavior across multiple states and relationships. We researched Alpine celebrations and identified vulnerabilities in his business structure that could be exploited legally if he refused to cooperate. Most importantly, we developed a specific proposal for restitution that would result in full recovery of stolen funds while allowing Ryan to avoid criminal prosecution if he agreed to our terms. Jake insisted on accompanying me to Aspen, both for emotional support and as a witness to whatever transpired. "You've been fighting this battle mostly alone for 2 months," he said when I initially resisted his involvement. "But you're not alone anymore, Emma. Whatever happens with Ryan, you have people who believe in you and support you." The night before we left for Colorado, I stood in the guest room at the Harrison farmhouse, packing clothes and documents for a trip that felt like the culmination of everything I'd been working toward since Ryan's disappearance. The woman who had discovered that devastating note on December 20th felt like a different person entirely. That woman had been trusting, dependent, and unprepared for the reality of systematic deception. The woman preparing for this confrontation was informed, strategic, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. My phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Whatever happens in Aspen, remember that you've already won. You've rebuilt your business, strengthened your relationships, and transformed yourself into someone who can't be victimized again. Ryan may have started this game, but you're going to finish it." As I closed my suitcase and prepared for sleep, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in just 2 months. The devastation I'd felt on Christmas morning had been real and profound, but it had also been the beginning of a transformation that had made me stronger, smarter, and more capable than I'd ever been before. Tomorrow, I would face the person who had tried to destroy me, armed with evidence of his crimes and confidence in my own strength. The confrontation in Aspen would be the test of everything I'd learned and everything I'd become. But I was no longer afraid of that test. Ryan had taught me more than he'd ever intended about manipulation, deception, and betrayal. Now I was going to use those lessons to ensure that his ability to harm others would end permanently, and that the money he'd stolen would be returned to the people who had earned it through honest work and genuine trust. The flight to Denver was turbulent, matching the storm of emotions churning inside me, as Jake and I made our way toward what would either be the resolution of my nightmare, or its escalation into something even more complex. During the drive from Denver to Aspen, winding through snow-covered mountain passes, I reviewed my strategy one final time. This wasn't about confronting an ex-fiancé who had broken my heart. This was about facing a calculated criminal who had systematically destroyed multiple lives, and I needed to approach the situation with the same level of calculation he had used against me. Sophia had provided me with a detailed map of Ryan's new life in Aspen, gathered through weeks of careful investigation. Alpine celebrations operated out of a rented office space in the downtown district, positioned to serve the wealthy clientele who frequented the exclusive ski resort. The business had already secured several high-profile wedding contracts for the upcoming summer season, events that would bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue. Ryan wasn't hiding or struggling in his new location. He was thriving, using the money he'd stolen from me and his family to build exactly the kind of successful event planning business we had dreamed of creating together in Millbrook. "Are you ready for this?" Jake asked as we pulled into the parking lot of the Aspen Mountain Lodge, where we'd reserved rooms for what we hoped would be a brief but decisive stay. I looked at myself in the passenger side mirror, seeing someone I barely recognized from 3 months ago. Gone was the soft, trusting woman who had believed that love and good intentions were enough to build a secure future. In her place was someone harder, more analytical, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who might try to deceive her. I've been ready since the moment I realized who I was really dealing with. Our first stop was Alpine Celebrations, where I intended to observe Ryan's operation firsthand before making my presence known. The office was located in a converted Victorian house that had been transformed into upscale commercial space, exactly the kind of charming, expensive venue that would appeal to Aspen's affluent clientele. Through the large front windows, I could see a tastefully decorated reception area with elegant furniture and carefully curated displays of wedding photography that showcased the kind of luxury events Ryan was now coordinating. Jake positioned himself across the street while I approached the front entrance, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and controlled fury. The young woman at the reception desk looked up with a practiced smile that faltered slightly when she saw my face, perhaps sensing something predatory in my expression. "Good afternoon," I said, maintaining perfect composure. "I'm interested in discussing event planning services for a wedding next fall. Is Mr. Harrison available for a consultation?" "Oh, I'm so sorry," the receptionist replied, "but Mr. Harrison is currently meeting with clients. However, I'd be happy to schedule you for later this week, or perhaps our assistant planner could—" "That's quite all right," I interrupted smoothly. "I'll wait. This is regarding a very substantial budget, and I prefer to work directly with the principal of the firm." Before she could respond, I heard a familiar voice from the inner office, that same confident tone Ryan had used when charming potential clients in Millbrook. The sound sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system, but I forced myself to remain calm and focused. After a few minutes, the office door opened, and a well-dressed couple emerged, followed by the man who had once promised to love me forever and had instead systematically destroyed everything I'd built. Ryan looked exactly as I remembered, but somehow smaller, diminished by the context of seeing him through my new understanding of his true nature. He was wearing an expensive suit that I was certain had been purchased with money stolen from his own family, and his smile had the same practiced charm that had once made me believe I was the luckiest woman in the world. When his eyes met mine, that smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered his composure. "Emma?" he said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is certainly unexpected." "Hello, Ryan," I replied, noting how the receptionist and departing clients were watching our interaction with curiosity. "We need to talk. Privately." He glanced around the reception area, clearly calculating the potential damage to his professional image if our conversation became public. "Of course. Why don't you come into my office?" As I followed him into the elegantly appointed space that he'd furnished with stolen money, I took careful note of everything I saw. The expensive furniture, the high-end computer equipment, the framed certificates and awards that created an illusion of established credibility, all of it built on a foundation of fraud and betrayal. On his desk, I noticed photographs from recent events, lavish celebrations that demonstrated the success he'd achieved by abandoning his previous life and everyone in it. "You look well," Ryan said, settling behind his desk in a gesture that was clearly meant to establish dominance in the conversation. "I have to admit, I'm surprised to see you here. I thought you'd be focused on picking up the pieces back in Millbrook." "Oh, I've done much more than pick up pieces," I replied, taking the seat across from him and placing my briefcase deliberately on his desk. "I've rebuilt everything you tried to destroy, and I've learned quite a lot about you in the process." Something flickered in his eyes, a hint of uncertainty that told me he was beginning to realize this wasn't the broken, desperate woman he'd left behind. "Emma, I know you're probably angry about how things ended between us, but you have to understand—" "I understand perfectly," I interrupted, opening my briefcase and removing Sophia's comprehensive investigation file. "I understand that you're a professional fraud artist who has been running similar schemes for years. I understand that you researched me carefully before we ever met, identifying me as an ideal target for long-term manipulation. And I understand that your new business here in Aspen is built entirely on money you stole from me and your own family. The color drained from Ryan's face as I spread documents across his desk, each page representing hours of careful investigation and analysis. Bank records showing the movement of funds from Millbrook to Aspen. Business registration documents revealing the timeline of his planning. Evidence of his previous fraudulent activities in New Hampshire and Connecticut. By the time I finished laying out the evidence, Ryan's confident demeanor had completely evaporated. "This is quite impressive," he said, his voice now carrying a note of genuine respect mixed with concern. "But Emma, even if everything you've uncovered is accurate, the legal complexities of pursuing this across state lines, the time and expense involved." "Who said anything about legal proceedings?" I asked, allowing a small smile to cross my face. "Ryan, you've misunderstood the purpose of this visit. I'm not here as a victim seeking justice through the courts. I'm here as a businesswoman, offering you a very reasonable settlement proposal." I removed a final document from my briefcase, a carefully crafted agreement that Sophia and I had developed over multiple revisions. Full restitution of all funds stolen from Heritage Event Planning and Mountain View Restaurant, totaling $80,000, to be transferred within 48 hours. Additionally, you'll provide a detailed list of all clients you defrauded in previous locations, allowing me to warn them about your activities. In exchange, I won't file criminal charges, won't contact your current clients about your fraudulent background, and won't share this information with local law enforcement here in Aspen. Ryan read through the document carefully, and I watched his face as he realized the thoroughness of my preparation and the strength of my position. "And if I refuse, then I make some phone calls," I replied calmly. "Starting with your current clients, particularly the Morrison family, whose daughter's wedding you're planning for next month. I imagine they'd be very interested to learn that their event planner is using money stolen from his previous victims to fund his business operations. Then I contact the Colorado Attorney General's office, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and the local media outlets that love stories about fraud in exclusive resort communities." The silence stretched between us as Ryan weighed his options. I could see him calculating, trying to find an angle that would allow him to maintain his new life while minimizing his losses. But Sophia had helped me anticipate every possible escape route, and the agreement I'd crafted left him with no viable alternatives except compliance. "You've become quite formidable," he said finally, a note of what might have been admiration in his voice. The Emma I knew would never have been capable of this kind of strategic thinking. "The Emma you knew was an illusion you cultivated for your own purposes," I replied. "The woman sitting across from you now is who I really am when I'm not being systematically deceived and manipulated." Ryan leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same analytical gaze I'd once interpreted as romantic interest. "What happened to forgiveness? To moving on and building a new life? You've clearly done well for yourself since I left. Why come all this way to destroy what I've built here?" "Because what you've built here isn't legitimate," I said, my voice hardening. "It's the same pattern you've repeated in multiple locations, and it will continue until someone stops you permanently. This isn't about revenge, Ryan. This is about ensuring that you never have the opportunity to do to someone else what you did to me and your family." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing the reality of his situation. The evidence against him was overwhelming, my preparation was thorough, and his options were extremely limited. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that I wasn't motivated by emotion or personal vendetta, but by a cold determination to see justice served. "The money you're demanding," he said slowly, "that would essentially destroy everything I've built here. Alpine celebrations, my living situation, my plans for the future. It would all be gone." "Then you should have considered that before you stole from people who trusted you," I replied without sympathy. "You made choices, Ryan. You chose to build your success on other people's money and other people's pain. Now you get to live with the consequences of those choices." My phone buzzed with a text from Jake, who was monitoring the situation from across the street. "Everything okay? You've been in there for 30 minutes. I showed Ryan the message. "My backup is getting concerned. I suggest we finalize this agreement quickly." Ryan's shoulders sagged in defeat. "You really have thought of everything, haven't you?" "I learned from the best," I replied. "You taught me that success requires careful planning, strategic thinking, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to achieve your goals. I'm simply applying those lessons in a direction you didn't anticipate." The signing of the restitution agreement took another hour, during which Ryan's lawyer was contacted by phone to review the terms and confirm that his client understood the implications of compliance versus refusal. The attorney, clearly unfamiliar with the full scope of Ryan's fraudulent activities, advised him that the agreement was far more favorable than anything he could expect through litigation or criminal proceedings. As Ryan signed the final document, I felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice served and future victims protected. "The transfers need to be completed by Friday," I reminded him. "Sophia, we'll be monitoring all the accounts to ensure compliance." "And after that?" Ryan asked. "What happens to me?" "That's entirely up to you," I replied, gathering my documents. "You can try to rebuild your life honestly, using skills and resources you earn legitimately. Or you can continue running the same schemes in new locations until someone less forgiving than me catches up with you. But Ryan, if I ever hear about you victimizing someone else the way you victimized me and your family, this agreement becomes void, and I'll pursue every legal option available." Walking out of Alpine celebrations, I felt lighter than I had in months. The confrontation had gone exactly as Sophia and I had planned. But more importantly, it had demonstrated to myself how completely I had transformed from victim to victor. The woman who had discovered that devastating note on Christmas morning could never have orchestrated what had just transpired. That woman had been trusting, dependent, and unprepared for the reality of systematic deception. The woman walking out of Ryan's office was strategic, self-reliant, and completely capable of protecting herself and others from similar manipulation. Jake was waiting across the street, and the relief on his face when he saw me was profound. "How did it go?" "Better than I hoped," I replied, showing him the signed agreement. "Full restitution, complete compliance, and a very clear understanding that his days of victimizing innocent people are over." That evening, in our hotel restaurant overlooking the snow-covered mountains of Aspen, Jake and I celebrated what felt like the end of a very long nightmare and the beginning of a new chapter. "You know," he said, raising his glass of wine, "I think Ryan did you a favor by disappearing when he did." "How do you figure that?" "Because if he'd gone through with the wedding, if he'd continued the deception for years longer, you might never have discovered who you really are when you're not being manipulated." The woman who walked into that office today, who negotiated that agreement, who rebuilt her business from nothing, she's incredible. And I don't think she would have existed if Ryan hadn't forced her to emerge. Looking out at the mountain, landscape that Ryan had chosen for his new beginning, I realized that Jake was right. The betrayal that had initially felt like the end of my world had actually been the beginning of discovering my true strength. Ryan had tried to destroy me by taking everything I thought mattered, but in the process, he'd revealed capabilities and resilience I never knew I possessed. My phone buzzed with a message from Sophia. "Received confirmation of the first transfer, $40,000 deposited to Mountain View restaurant account. Remaining balance expected tomorrow as agreed." The financial restitution was important, but it wasn't the most significant victory. The real triumph was the transformation of Emma Rodriguez from victim to victor, from someone who trusted blindly to someone who understood exactly how to identify and neutralize threats. Ryan's betrayal had been meant to break me, but instead, it had forged me into someone infinitely stronger and more capable than the woman he'd tried to manipulate. Tomorrow we would fly back to Vermont, where I would continue building the new event planning business that had already exceeded every goal heritage event planning had ever achieved. But tonight, looking out at the mountains that had briefly sheltered my former fiancé's fraudulent schemes, I allowed myself to appreciate how far I'd traveled from that devastating Christmas morning to this moment of complete vindication and renewal. 6 months after the confrontation in Aspen, I stood in the beautifully renovated event space that had once been a neglected barn on the Harrison family property, watching a bride and groom exchange vows under a canopy of twinkling lights and fresh mountain laurel. The transformation of this space into Vermont's most sought-after wedding venue had become a symbol of my own evolution from victim to visionary entrepreneur. What had started as a desperate attempt to salvage heritage event planning had grown into something far more ambitious and successful than anything Ryan and I had ever dreamed of creating together. Emma's Celebrations, as the new business was called, had become the premier event planning service in central Vermont, with a waiting list that extended 18 months into the future. The combination of my organizational expertise, Jake's culinary talents, and the Harrison family's established community connections had created something unique in the regional market. A full-service celebration company that could handle everything from intimate dinner parties to elaborate destination weddings, with a level of personal attention and creative vision that larger firms couldn't match. But the success of the business was only part of the transformation that had emerged from Ryan's betrayal. The woman who had once defined herself through her relationship with someone else had discovered an identity built on her own capabilities, her own vision, and her own understanding of what it meant to create genuine value in other people's lives. Every wedding I planned, every celebration I orchestrated, every moment of joy I helped create for my clients served as evidence that my worth wasn't dependent on someone else's validation or approval. The financial restitution from Ryan had been completed exactly as agreed, with the full $80,000 transferred back to the accounts he had systematically drained. But more valuable than the recovered money was the comprehensive list he had provided of his previous victims, which Sophia and I had used to contact and warn people across 3 states about his fraudulent activities. 2 of those individuals had actually become clients of Emma's Celebrations, drawn by the story of my transformation and the security of working with someone who understood deception intimately and was committed to absolute transparency. Jake had become far more than just a business partner. He had evolved into my closest friend and most trusted advisor, someone whose steady presence and unwavering support had helped me navigate the emotional complexity of rebuilding my life. Our working relationship had a natural harmony that Ryan and I had never achieved, built on mutual respect and shared values, rather than manipulation and hidden agendas. Where Ryan had always been planning his next move or calculating his advantage, Jake was consistently present, reliable, and genuinely committed to building something meaningful together. Emma called Sophia Chen, who had driven up from Burlington, to attend today's wedding as my guest. I wanted you to know that the FBI contacted me yesterday about Ryan's case. Apparently, your documentation has helped them build a federal fraud case that extends across multiple states. He won't be victimizing anyone else for a very long time. The news brought a satisfaction that went far beyond personal vindication. Every person Ryan had manipulated, every family whose trust he had violated, every community he had deceived would finally see justice served. More importantly, the precedent established by our successful confrontation had inspired other victims to come forward with their own stories, creating a network of evidence that had made prosecution inevitable. How many other victims were there? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the full scope of Ryan's destructive career. At least 14 confirmed cases across 7 states, dating back almost 10 years, Sophia replied. Your willingness to pursue direct confrontation rather than just cutting your losses probably prevented him from victimizing dozens more people over the next decade. As the wedding reception continued around us, I reflected on how completely my understanding of strength and vulnerability had evolved. The woman who had discovered Ryan's betrayal on Christmas morning had believed that trusting others was a sign of virtue and that being deceived made her somehow deficient or naive. The woman I had become understood that trust was something to be earned through consistency and transparency, and that being victimized by a professional manipulator was not a reflection of personal weakness, but of someone else's calculated cruelty. Madison Torres, who had become the legal counsel for Emma's celebrations, joined our conversation with a glass of champagne and a satisfied smile. "Emma, I just finished reviewing the contracts for next year's bookings. You're going to exceed last year's revenue by almost 300%. More importantly, your client satisfaction ratings are unprecedented. People aren't just hiring you to plan their events, they're hiring you because they trust you completely." That trust had become the foundation of everything I'd built since Ryan's departure. Unlike the superficial charm and false promises that had characterized his approach to business, my success was built on radical honesty about timelines, costs, and limitations. Clients knew exactly what they were paying for, exactly when it would be delivered, and exactly how every dollar of their money was being spent. The transparency that Ryan had taught me to value through his absence had become my greatest competitive advantage. Carol Harrison approached our group, her face glowing with pride as she watched her youngest son coordinating the evening's dinner service with the skill and confidence that had made him an integral part of our success. "Emma, I wanted to thank you again for what you've given our family. Not just the business partnership, but the way you've helped Jake discover his own potential. He's become someone I barely recognize from the quiet boy who used to hide in his brother's shadow." Looking across the reception space, I could see Jake directing his kitchen team with natural leadership and creative vision that had flourished once he was no longer competing with Ryan for recognition and resources. The catering operation, that had started as a way to fulfill our existing contracts, had evolved into one of the most respected culinary experiences in Vermont, with food magazines featuring our innovative approach to farm-to-table celebration dining. "Mrs. Harrison," I replied, "Jake gave me the foundation I needed to rebuild when I had lost everything. His friendship and partnership saved me from giving up on myself when that would have been the easiest choice." As the evening progressed, and the last guest departed into the crisp Vermont night, Jake and I worked together to oversee the cleanup and preparation for tomorrow's brunch celebration. Our coordination had become effortless over the months, a seamless collaboration that made even the most complex events feel manageable and enjoyable. "Emma," Jake said as we finished reviewing the next day's schedule, "I got a call yesterday from a wedding planner in Burlington. She's heard about what we've built here and wants to discuss a partnership for larger events. Apparently, word is spreading about our approach to client service and financial transparency." The opportunity represented another step in the growth that had consistently exceeded my expectations, but it also reminded me of how far I'd traveled from the woman who had once needed Ryan's approval for every business decision. "What do you think about the partnership idea?" "I think we should meet with her and see if her values align with ours," Jake replied. "But Emma, whatever we decide, it's going to be our decision based on what's best for our clients and our business. No hidden agendas, no secret planning, no one person controlling information that affects everyone else." His words highlighted the fundamental difference between the business I was building now and the one I had tried to create with Ryan. Emma's celebrations operated on principles of shared decision-making, transparent communication, and mutual accountability that made deception and manipulation impossible. Every financial transaction was documented and reviewed by multiple people. Every client interaction was recorded and shared among team members. Every business decision was made through collaborative discussion rather than individual calculation. Later that night, after Jake had returned to his apartment above the restaurant and the Harrison family farmhouse had settled into peaceful quiet, I walked through the event space that had become the physical manifestation of my transformation. The barn that had been neglected and forgotten had been restored to become something beautiful and functional, much like my own journey from betrayal to renewal. My phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. and for a moment, my heart rate quickened with the old fear that Ryan might be trying to contact me. Instead, the message was from Jennifer Walsh, a bride whose wedding I had planned 3 months earlier. "Emma, I just wanted you to know that Marcus and I are expecting our first baby. We've been telling everyone that our marriage got off to such a perfect start because of the incredible celebration you created for us. Thank you for making our wedding day so magical and stress-free." Messages like Jennifer's had become regular occurrences, reminders that the work I was doing had meaning beyond financial success or professional achievement. Every celebration I helped create contributed to the foundation of someone else's happiness, and that knowledge had given my life a sense of purpose that I'd never experienced during my relationship with Ryan. I walked to the window that overlooked the valley where Millbrook spread out below, its lights twinkling like scattered stars against the dark landscape. Somewhere out there was the Riverside Cabin where I had discovered Ryan's betrayal, now occupied by a young couple who had purchased it from the bank after I'd been unable to maintain the mortgage payments. I felt no sadness about losing that house, which had come to represent illusion and deception rather than the home I had once believed it to be. The guest room where I now lived in the Harrison farmhouse had become more of a sanctuary than any space I'd ever shared with Ryan. It was modest but comfortable, furnished with pieces I had chosen myself rather than items selected to create an impression or maintain an image. More importantly, it was a space where I could be completely authentic, where I never had to wonder if someone was studying my reactions for signs of weakness or vulnerability. My laptop sat open on the desk, displaying the business plan I'd been developing for a second Emma's Celebrations location in the Burlington area. The expansion represented not just business growth, but personal confidence in my ability to replicate the success I'd achieved in Millbrook. Unlike the desperate scrambling that had characterized my attempts to salvage heritage event planning, this expansion was being planned methodically, with extensive market research, conservative financial projections, and multiple contingency plans. Sophia had helped me structure the new venture with legal protections that would prevent any single individual from gaining the kind of access that had allowed Ryan to destroy our previous business. Every account required dual authorization for significant transactions. Every contract included specific clauses protecting client deposits. Every business relationship was documented with agreements that clearly defined responsibilities and limitations. "You've become almost paranoid about protecting yourself," Madison had observed during our last legal review session. "Is that sustainable? Long-term? Or will it prevent you from building the kind of trust that makes partnerships work?" "There's a difference between paranoia and prudence," I had replied. "Ryan taught me that trust should be earned through consistent behavior over time, not granted based on charm or promises. The protections I'm building aren't about expecting betrayal. They're about creating systems where betrayal becomes impossible." As I reviewed the expansion plans one more time before closing the laptop, I realized that my approach to business had become a reflection of my approach to life in general. Where I had once been trusting to the point of naivety, I was now careful, without being cynical. Where I had once been dependent on others for validation and direction, I was now self-reliant while remaining open to collaboration and partnership. The woman who had been devastated by Ryan's abandonment had believed that her worth was determined by someone else's commitment to her. The woman I had become understood that her value came from her own capabilities, her own integrity, and her own contribution to other people's happiness and success. The betrayal that had initially seemed like the end of everything meaningful had actually been the beginning of discovering what was most meaningful of all. The knowledge that I could create something beautiful and valuable entirely through my own efforts and vision. A soft knock on my door interrupted my reflection. Jake's voice called quietly, "Emma, are you still awake? There's something I wanted to talk to you about." I opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, looking simultaneously nervous and determined in a way that reminded me of important conversations we'd shared throughout our partnership. "What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about the Burlington expansion, about our partnership, About everything we've built together, he said, stepping into the room and settling into the chair by the window. Emma, I need you to know that working with you, building this business together, watching you transform from someone who had lost everything into someone who could create all of this, it's been the most meaningful experience of my life. His words carried an emotional weight that made me suddenly aware of how much our relationship had deepened beyond business partnership into something I hadn't dared to define or examine too closely. Jake, you've been the most important person in my recovery and my success. I couldn't have rebuilt anything without your support and friendship. That's what I wanted to talk to you about, he continued, his voice carrying a vulnerability I'd rarely heard from him. Emma, I've fallen in love with you, not with the idea of rescuing you or being needed by someone who is hurt, but with who you are now, who you've become, the strength and wisdom and compassion you've developed through everything you've survived. The admission hung between us, changing the atmosphere in the room and forcing me to confront feelings I'd been carefully avoiding since Ryan's betrayal. The woman who had once trusted blindly was now almost afraid to trust at all, especially when it came to romantic feelings that had been so thoroughly weaponized against her. Jake, I said softly, I care about you more than I've cared about anyone in a very long time. But I'm terrified of making the same mistakes again, of trusting my judgment about someone's intentions when I was so completely wrong before. I understand that fear, he replied. And I'm not asking you to trust blindly or to make any decisions based on feelings alone. I'm asking you to trust the evidence of our partnership, the consistency of my actions over the past year, the transparency of our working relationship, and the fact that I've never asked for anything from you except the opportunity to support your success. His approach, so different from Ryan's romantic manipulation and grand gestures, felt solid and trustworthy in a way that my previous relationship never had. Where Ryan had swept me off my feet with promises and excitement, Jake was offering something much more valuable, a foundation built on proven reliability and shared values. What are you suggesting? I asked, needing to understand exactly what he was proposing and what it would mean for our business and personal relationship. I'm suggesting that we explore the possibility of building something together that goes beyond business partnership, he said. But slowly, carefully, with the same transparency and honesty that has made our professional relationship so successful. No hidden agendas, no secret plans, no one person controlling information that affects the other. Looking at Jake in the eye, soft light of my guest room, I realized that the trust he was asking for wasn't the blind faith that Ryan had exploited. It was informed confidence based on months of consistent behavior, shared challenges, and mutual support. The woman who had once been afraid to trust anyone now had the tools to distinguish between manipulation and authenticity. I'd like that, I said, feeling a mix of excitement and caution that seemed perfectly appropriate for someone who had learned the difference between healthy and unhealthy romantic dynamics. But Jake, if we're going to explore this possibility, it has to be with complete honesty about our fears, our expectations, and our boundaries. I wouldn't want it any other way, he replied, reaching out to take my hand in a gesture that felt both intimate and respectful. Emma, you've taught me that real strength comes from facing difficult truths and building something genuine from that foundation. I want to apply that lesson to every aspect of our relationship. As we talked through the early hours of morning, discussing our hopes and concerns about mixing personal and professional relationships, I reflected on how completely my understanding of love and partnership had evolved. Ryan had taught me to associate romance with excitement, unpredictability, and the thrill of being chosen by someone charismatic and confident. Jake was showing me that real love might be quieter, but infinitely more secure, built on friendship, respect, and the daily choice to support each other's growth and happiness. The sunrise found us still talking, planning not just the future of our business, but the possibility of a personal future that honored everything I'd learned about the eye. Difference between authentic and manipulative relationships. The woman who had been broken by betrayal had become someone capable of recognizing and choosing genuine love, armed with the wisdom that comes from surviving deception and emerging stronger on the other side. Up next, you've got 2 more stand out. Stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.